All right, sis. What are you working on as a reader right now?
Well, I'm working on solving these big words that kind of help me prepare for the next grade.
Oh, like what kind of words?
Like, sometimes I have trouble reading the word national since it's a big word.
That is a big word. It's a really big word. What books are you reading right now? Can you show me a couple of them?
These ones are kind of tricky.
It was George Washington Carver. A good one. I've been noticing you reading this one a lot lately. Tiger's book. So you have 2 nonfiction books here. Do you enjoy reading nonfiction? That's great. Well, I love that you've been working on figuring out those tricky words because that's a really important skill to have. Can you read a little bit for me?
Okay.
Okay.
When George woke up the next morning,
Let's put it up here. There we go. So I can see it too.
When George woke up the next morning, he stepped outside. The owner of the barn, Maria Watkins, saw him. She figured he was hungry, so she fixed him some breakfast in the main house. "What's your name?" Maria asked him. I'm Carver's George," he said. That sounded as if Carver owned George. Miss Watkins, who was black, didn't like that. Slavery had ended more than 10 years earlier, and nobody owned anyone else. So Mr. Watkins called him George Carver. George told Mrs. Watkins that he was in Neo show to go to school, but he didn't have a place to live yet. He figured something out. Miss Watkins was a kind woman, so she told George he could stay with her and her husband, Andrew. But she also was strict, no-nonsense woman. If George was going to live there and go to the nearby Lincoln School, named after Abraham Lincoln, he'd have to do his share of the chores. George was delighted with that deal.
Okay, read that sentence again.
George had to do his share of chores. George was delighted with that deal.
Okay, pause right there. You're a great reader. You have awesome expression when you're reading. And one thing I notice is that when you miss a word, a lot of times you'll go back and you'll reread that. You'll reread that word or reread that sentence. That's a good thing. That's a thing that good readers always do, is they go back and reread. Now, can I teach you something that you can do that's going to raise your reading from like here to here? Okay. So sometimes you read tricky words and you have come up with some ways to solve those words. Something that we have to do is go back and reread the whole sentence, especially if we find those tricky words. The reason we do that is because they sometimes need to have some time to get stuck in our brains. And if you only read it once and you fix yourself and then you move on, you don't have time or you don't have the brain power to go back and be like, oh, I know what that said. So you got to go back and reread once you self-correct. So like for this one, George was delighted with that deal. We got kind of stuck on that a few times, right? So I had you start back at the beginning and reread that so that you could comprehend in your brain what that was actually saying, okay? So we're going to read a little bit further and we're going to practice going back and rereading if we have to figure out a tricky word. Sound like a plan? So what are you going to do?
I'm going to go back and try and fix myself.
Okay, go back and reread the whole sentence. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, start right at Moses Carver.
Moses Carver had taught George not to waste anything. Now Mrs. Watkins taught him not to waste any time. She expected him to go to school during the day, but to come home at recess and do laundry. After school, he would clean up the house and maybe help cook dinner. George and Mr. and Mrs. Watkins read the Bible during the week, and they went to church on Sundays. Sometimes George walked back to Diamond Grove to visit Moses and Susan and Jim on the weekends. The show was different than Diamond Grove.
So that's where you would stop and you would go back and reread. So start at the beginning again and reread it.
The show was different than Diamond Grove.
What do you think that means?
Like this different state or country was kind of different than where we first lived in Diamond Grove.
Okay, very good. And you can tell that because you went back and you reread for some comprehension, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with a little note. This can become your little bookmark for a while, okay? And it's going to say, stop, think, go back, reread. Stop, think, go back, reread. Okay? So when you have to stop at a tricky word, think of what it says, go back to the beginning of the sentence, and reread. Okay? Can you do that? Okay. You're an awesome reader, Asha Rose. Thank you.